All right, so today we're going to talk about biochemistry, but we're actually going to look at the molecules that are involved in this unit. So basically, everything we are going to talk about contains carbon. So that's like the definition of organic molecules is the fact that it contains carbon. So we're going to look at some of these characteristics of carbon. So carbon is able to bond to 4 different things, and it's very versatile, which means it can bond to many things, and it will share 4 electrons. And we usually will see in our body carbon bonded to oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus are the main elements in our body. All right, so macromolecules, you also hear me call them biomolecules or also called organic molecules. It's all the same thing. Basically, they're just really big molecules in our body that perform certain functions, and it makes up basically most of our body. So if you'll see, this is a macromolecule. This right here is a protein right here made up of a bunch of amino acids, which are made of many atoms, and they are all connected together. So the 4 types we're going to learn about, is we're going to learn about carbohydrates, which is just like sugar, bread, glucose, any of those sweet things, or starches. And then we're going to talk about lipids, which is just fats. And then we will discuss proteins and nucleic acids. And this is what our DNA is made out of. And I'm pretty sure most of you at least heard of these words. So something that's, let me move on. A characteristic of a carbohydrate is that it contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen only, and it has a ratio. The ratio is the same every time. It's 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So there's always 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. What we use carbohydrates for is a source of energy. At least we do. We use them as the main source of energy. That's what we will use first. Some plants will use them for structural purposes. Some animals too, but we really use proteins for structure. We use carbohydrates for energy. Smaller molecules, we'll learn about glucose. We'll see that a lot this year. So sugars, there's some vocabulary words for us to look at. So monosaccharide, just mono means 1, okay? So that just means, and saccharide means sugar. So that basically means 1 sugar. And then this di means 2, okay? So that's 2 sugars. So this is 1 sugar, this is glucose. And then this is a disaccharide. There are 2 sugars joined together. And if you join me in AP biology, we'll talk about dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis on how this little oxygen gets the way it does. But that's not what we're talking about today. So polysaccharide, just poly means more than 1. So more than 1, multiple. So multiple sugars connected together. And that's what you see here is a string of these little sugars connected together, and then they end up creating this structure that becomes a tree. So the 3 common ones we're going to talk about are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So starch is found in plants, and this is stuff that we eat like from a potato, and it's just a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together. Then there's glycogen, which is also a bunch of glucose bonded together, and these 2 will tend to, they seem to be exactly the same thing, but these 2, they'll differ by the way the molecule is flipped within that little string of glucose molecules, and I'll show you that in class. So glycogen is only found in us. So starch is found in plants, and glycogen is found in us. So it's basically the same thing. Except we store it in the liver, okay? And then starches, this is where plants store their extra glucose. Now, cellulose, if you've ever eaten a piece of celery and it was all stringy and tough, that's cellulose that you're feeling that kind of peels down, almost like a celery banana. I don't know how to explain it, but cellulose is that stuff that peels off as you try to bite into a celery stick. All right, so some fats. We are moving on to fat. Oops. All right, so the biological term for fat is just lipids. So you'll see fats, oils, and waxes are examples of lipids. They are generally not soluble in water, which means they're hydrophobic. They tend to form little bubbles. If you've ever eaten soup or mixed water with oil, you've seen those little bubbles on top of your water or your soup. Um, and that's what they're talking about as being not soluble in water. Now, lipids, they also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but not in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. It gets kind of crazy, the ratios. Well, there's not a ratio. They're much bigger molecules than simple sugar. So you'll see in a minute some of the examples of the molecule structure. So the building blocks of this, or building blocks, are also called monomers. We'll see that in a minute. But the building block is fatty acid and glycerol. So this may be, yeah, here it is. So do you guys remember in middle school when you were learning about the cell membrane, and it was this, the cell membrane is made out of the phospholipid bilayer, where the lipid had a little head, like a little circle on the top with like 2 little squiggly lines underneath? That is the lipid. That is what we're looking at here. So that little head part that you were looking at, you're now looking at them in a molecule form or a molecular form, where you see the actual elements or atoms inside the little circle. So that's what's in the little circle. It's very polar, so it's going to like the water, and it'll be near the water. Now, these little tails are called the fatty acids. So these little tails here are fatty acids, and it's just a long string of carbon with hydrogens attached. Same here, long string of carbons with hydrogen attached. And we're going to talk about this double bond here in just a minute. Right here, the glycerol is just the little polar head. Okay, so the circle and the 3 carbon chain here, that's called glycerol. So now this double bond I told you we would talk about is the difference between saturated and unsaturated fat. So saturated fat means it is saturated in these hydrogens, okay? So you have, other than the carbons combined connected to it, the hydrogens here, there's no double bonds present, okay? So every carbon is connected to those hydrogens. Now, an unsaturated fat is where there's a double bond between 2 carbons. So you see here there's some missing hydrogens. That's because those bonds went into this double bond. So this one is unsaturated, this one's saturated. And the reason it's unsaturated is because of this double bond. So here's just some like real life examples of saturated and unsaturated fat. So this solid butter is saturated. And then this liquid oil, vegetable oil or olive oil, or the liquid oil that you use to cook with, those tend to be unsaturated. So things we use lipids for. For sure, the main thing we use lipids for is energy, to store our energy, right? We eat too much, even though it may not even be fattening, we will still be able to store energy in the form of lipid. We can create lipids out of sugar. We can create lipids out of many things. So they are super important for energy, but they are also important for building our cell membrane. So as you learned in middle school, you learned that cell membranes are made out of lipids. They form waterproof coverings on feathers, fruits, leaves. If you've ever felt fruit that hasn't been washed very well, or you pick fruit off the tree or something and you felt that waxy feeling on the top, that's a lipid that's causing that feeling, that waxy feeling on fruits and leaves. And the reason ducks don't they can come out of the water looking completely dry, and that's caused by having lipids on the outside of their feathers. Okay, so nucleic acids, this is the biological term for like DNA. A nucleic acid is just like a building block of DNA, okay? So the building blocks of the nucleic acids are nucleotides, and nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. And I mean, we have a whole unit on this, so we're not going to go too much in detail. Proteins, proteins are made from amino acids, okay? Not to be confused with nucleic acid. Okay, proteins are made from amino acids, and they're just like a bunch of amino acids strung together, and then they fold in a certain way and they become a protein. And we'll talk about the way they fold in just a minute. Give me 1 second. Okay, so when proteins combine together, there will be a certain ending. If you'll look at just, okay, so this is a bunch of amino acids about to make a protein. Don't freak out, okay? This is just a bunch. This is an amino acid, this is amino acid, this is an amino acid, and this is an amino acid. They're about to combine, and what they do when they combine is this side will combine with this side, and then they join together, and then same here. This will combine with this, and they join together. This will combine with this, and they join together. Okay, so you'll sometimes see these as R groups. Okay, this is the only difference between all the amino acids. So all the amino acids have all of this. Do you see? They all have that carboxyl group, the amino group, the single hydrogen atom. But then over here, it varies. This is the differences between all 20 amino acids, is what's sticking off of that alpha carbon or the center carbon. And those are called R groups. Some of them like the water, some of them are scared of the water, and so that will determine how they're folded. Oh, and as far as for proteins, we use them for so much. So you know how plants use carbohydrates for structure? Well, we use proteins for structure. So we use them for functioning, like enzymes, or like to regulate, like when we hit puberty, or when we have our periods, or when we get old, our hair turns gray. Like we have hormones for all kinds of cycles in our life. And then we have the hemoglobin, which transports what's it called? Oxygen. We have all these things that we use proteins for. Antibodies for immune system, membrane proteins. We have proteins for a lot of stuff. We build our body with proteins, and we send signals with proteins. So they're super, super important. All right, so enzymes, that's like a whole unit in itself. So enzyme is a type of protein, and their purpose is to speed up a chemical reaction. So things will happen in our bodies, but enzymes will make them happen faster. Sometimes, you know, if we didn't have enzymes, it would happen so slowly that we would actually die before our food is broken down. So they're very important. We would not live without them. So how they work is that they accept a substrate. Okay, so something like this, in this case it's two substrates, will fit into, they're very specific on how they fit, okay? And then once they're together, it's called an enzyme substrate complex. And then we go to the next step, and they will make that enzyme substrate something else. So then there's our product. So basically something goes in, the enzyme changes it, and then that new thing is called a product, and then the enzyme is able to be reused again. Where all the action happens is literally called the active site, so not everything in science is confusing. Okay, this is the enzyme, these are the molecules, the substrate molecules, and then these are the products, what's been made. So the active site, it's super specific. I don't know if it says that down there, but yeah, it's super specific. It's like a certain key for every lock. Okay, so nothing else will fit in there except whatever these two things are, and that's like a characteristic of enzymes. Okay, so this is basically what I just said. Enzymes are very specific. They only work for one thing, one purpose, and they do that purpose over and over and over again. There's a lot of them in our body, 2,000 at least, that we know of.